I suddenly woke up, drenched in cold sweat. The nightmare must have returned, but I couldn't recall it. Talking to the doctor had helped, but I knew trying to sleep again would only bring the nightmare back. I glanced at the clock. It was 5:15 a.m., almost time to get up anyway, so I decided to get dressed. Running a ranch demanded early starts and late nights, but I loved it. I had 600,000 acres in the rolling hills near the Sierra Nevada. My nearest neighbor was 50 miles in any direction. I'm sure of that because that's how far you have to travel to reach my property lines from the ranch house. I went into the bathroom, shaved, showered, and returned to my bedroom to get dressed. When I was ready, I looked like a typical cowboy. I was 42 years old. My hair had turned mostly gray, and my weight had dropped to 200 pounds from 250 pounds due to all the hard work on the ranch. My face had taken on a weathered look from the sun and the wind. Some women I had dated said I was ruggedly handsome. I no longer resembled the man who arrived from the Southwest 10 years ago. Hell, I didn't even resemble my Irish roots anymore, but I was still alone. I just couldn't bring myself to get close to any of the available women. That's not to say I didn't enjoy going into town, but I never found a woman I wanted to go further with. One of my ranch hands once told me, if you wake up with the same woman you had a week ago, it's time to head into town. So I followed his advice. As I got older, the time between trips grew longer, but I guess that happens to every guy. I made coffee and took a cup into my office. I was planning to start my day a bit earlier. I turned on the TV and tuned in to a national news network. I love my satellite dish. It allows me to keep in touch with the world while still enjoying rural life, and my dude ranch guests would go into withdrawal without it. This was a working ranch, with herds of beef cattle. We bred horses, sheep, and even a buffalo or two. About 5 years after I moved here, a small family drove up my driveway, pulling their travel trailer. They asked if they could camp on my property. They won points with me by just asking. Most people, inconsiderate as they are, would just set up camp without permission. Usually, I'd have to send one of my hands to tell them to leave. I really don't know why I said okay. Maybe it was because they asked, maybe it was the hope in their son's eyes, or maybe it was just that I had a good breakfast. Whatever it was, I sent one of the hands to help them pick out a good spot near the stream, under the trees, but close enough to the main part of the ranch that electric, water, and bathrooms were accessible. Early that evening, there was a knock on my front door. There stood the son, holding a huge platter of cookies. He offered them to me and said, "Thank you for letting us stay on your land. It's really nice here." I noticed his father standing in the shadows with a flashlight, clearly a proud father watching his son. The boy explained that his mother made the best cookies in the world and pointed out his favorites. I raised my voice so the father could hear me, thanked the boy, and invited both of them in for milk and cookies. We had a good time. The little boy got me thinking about my own children. It had been a long time since I ran away, never even taking the time to say goodbye. The next morning, I was working some of the horses in a corral near the main barn when I noticed the father and son watching me. I was due for a break, so I rode over to the fence where they were standing. The boy immediately reached for the horse's head to pet him. The horse I was riding was a mean stallion that would bite anyone who got close enough. I yelled at the boy not to touch. He jumped back and started to tear up. I really didn't mean to scare the boy, and I felt like a jerk. I got down off the horse, knelt down, and explained to the boy about the horse biting and how I didn't want him to get hurt. When I was done, I got a hug from him. Feeling bad, I took him into the barn and showed him a newly born colt that we hadn't let outside yet. She was as gentle as they came, so I let the youngster into the stall with her. He asked me a million questions about the foal and her mother. I guess I made a friend for life because for the next week, every time I turned around, the boy was right there next to me. The father apologized for his son's actions. I said it was no problem. I enjoyed the company. As the week went on, I bonded with the kid. He was about the same age as my son. My son lived back in the Southwest, and I hadn't seen him in years. I guess the boy was filling a need I didn't know I had. The little family stayed for a week. During that time, the boy managed to win over all the ranch hands he met. We were all sorry when they left. That fall, I decided to start a dude ranch with a family orientation. There wasn't much I had to do. My ranch had 6 cabins with electricity and running water. I set the boys to cleaning them up, adding water heaters, and anything else they needed. My main house was huge. The dining room could seat 30 people, and the living room was just as big. I also had a library filled with books on Western history, so I guess I was all set. We just winged the rest. I put a small ad in a vacation magazine back in the Southwest that catered to families. I got a bunch of replies and a few deposits. Not exactly a great start, but it was something. As the time for the first guests to arrive neared, I called a meeting with all my staff. We decided what the customers would do around the ranch, which horses were even-tempered enough for them to ride, what chores the guests could do, and what the menu would consist of. We even cleaned up an old wagon and outfitted it as a chuck wagon. Our plan was to take them on an overnight trail drive so they could get the real Old West experience. It slowly took off. After a few years, we were booked solid all summer long. It was nice having all the families running around. It made the ranch feel lived in. One morning, as I sipped my coffee, I started thinking about how I ended up on the ranch. It was a long and twisted journey. I was a bookkeeper for my uncle, Frank. I worked in a small office over one of his restaurants. You may not think a bookkeeper is a major job, but my uncle was the head of one of the largest crime families on the West Coast. I was in charge of all his money, both legally earned and otherwise. I was well respected within the family. One fateful day, we had a small kitchen fire and evacuated the building. Since I couldn't work, I went home. The garage was open, so I just pulled in and walked into the side door. The house was dead quiet. I heard a slight noise coming from upstairs. For some reason, I grabbed my son's baseball bat from near the door where he had left it and went to investigate. I quietly snuck upstairs and walked into my bedroom. That's where all the noise was coming from. There was a sight I'll never forget. I saw my wife with another man. She didn't even notice me. I started across the bedroom toward them when her lover turned his head and saw me. He looked at me and smirked. It was my enemy, Nick Russo, from another crime family. The look on his face said it all. He was with my wife to humiliate me. I really don't remember what happened next, but when the clouds of anger cleared, there was Frank lying in the bed with his head beaten to a pulp. I guess a 270-pound guy with a baseball bat could do some serious damage. He was gone. My wife was on the floor. It looked as if I took the bat to her also, but she was still breathing. I didn't know what to do next, so I called my cousin. He told me to calm down, get in my car, and drive over to one of his businesses. He'd take care of the cleanup. When I got there, I was put in a car and driven about 250 to 300 miles west, where we changed cars and continued driving for the next 2 days. We stayed in a small motel outside of Las Vegas, Nevada, for a couple of days. I got my head straight there. My handler explained that a cleanup crew sent by my cousin had made Frank's body disappear and had tossed my wife down the grand staircase into the foyer. They wanted it to look as if she fell down them. They then started the bedroom on fire to eliminate all signs of Frank's death. The fire department found my wife at the foot of the stairs and assumed she had fallen down them trying to avoid the fire. My wife's back had been broken when I hit her with the baseball bat. The rough handling she received severed her spinal cord at the location of the break. She would not have any feeling from the waist down. She lost the use of both legs and all control of her bladder and bowels. I had no sympathy for her after what she did to our marriage. One of her doctors felt that her injuries couldn't have been caused by a simple fall down a flight of stairs and wanted to investigate further. He lost interest in her shortly after buying a new cabin cruiser. I guess some associates of my cousin talked to him. My 2 children were with my elderly parents and doing okay. They were told that their mother had a boyfriend and was injured by him. They accepted that explanation because they had overheard phone calls between her and Frank. They never asked to see their mother in the hospital. My handler then tore my heart out. It seems that Frank's distant cousin was the don of another crime family, and he had placed a reward on my head. I couldn't go home again, and I'd never see my children again. On the last day there, my handler gave me a new briefcase. In it, I found everything I needed to become Ryan Blake. Tom O'Connor no longer existed. My life as I knew it ceased to exist. I was outfitted in Western-style clothes, just a simple ranch hand. My handler introduced me to another ranch hand, and we got in his pickup. We drove off to start my new life. I snapped back to the present and started my day. This was a Friday, and all the guests for the next 2 weeks were scheduled to arrive that morning. I walked into my office, turned the welcome sign on, fired up my PC, and started another Friday. Around noon, a limo pulled up to the office. I was outside at the time. My first thought was that these were going to be difficult guests. Most of the ones that arrived by limo were. The back door opened, and two teenage kids got out. My next thought was, here are two very spoiled kids with no parents in sight. Their stay would be short. I considered starting a pool with the hands on how long they'd last before wanting to return home. They stood around waiting for their luggage to be unloaded. I thought they looked a little familiar, but my thought process was interrupted by questions from my current customers. By the time I was done, one of my helpers had checked them in. At dinner that night, I gave my usual talk about the ranch and what we expected from our guests, as well as what they could expect from us. I reminded them that this was a working ranch and not a vacation spot that catered to every whim. If they wanted a spa treatment, they would be very disappointed, but I assured them we would bend over backward to make their stay memorable. I noticed the two kids had found a couple of peers from another family and seemed to be getting along. I might need to revise my estimate of their length of stay. Because this was a working ranch, I spent most of my time actually running the ranch. Hands that were assigned to our Dude Ranch customers had to be people persons. They loved the customers, and the customers enjoyed them. If they weren't explaining something, they were entertaining the customers with one tall tale or another. About a week later, I noticed some noise coming from one of the smaller barns where we stored hay and grain for the horses. When I investigated, I found one of the teenage boys fooling around with one of the teenage girls. While I understood teenage hormones, I also needed to prevent this behavior, so I not so discreetly cleared my throat. They weren't actually having sex, but they were close. I was a teenager once myself, so I understood where they were coming from, but on the other hand, I guess I was going to play the part of her father. I gave the boy a hard look and said, "Get boy." I almost laughed as he ran for the door, bent over at the waist. I turned my hard look on the girl and told her to finish getting dressed and meet me in the study in the main house because we were going to have a talk. I turned and walked out of the barn, trying to decide exactly how I was going to handle this. I didn't have a clue how to begin. I never raised children, let alone a teenage girl. By the time I reached the house, I decided that I'd use the responsible adult approach for my talk with her. About 10 minutes later, she walked into the study. She was still crying. I pointed to a chair across from me and asked if she wanted something to drink. I got myself a soda as she shook her head no. Trying to keep my voice soft and even, I tried to imagine what I'd want someone to say to my daughter if the situation were reversed. I talked to her for the next 30 minutes. I guess I was getting a little carried away. I felt like one of those country preachers. I was in the middle of my save yourself for someone you really love speech when she looked up and started studying my face. Suddenly, she said, "You've got my grandmother's eyes and grandpa's voice and mannerisms." The tears started flowing. "Are you my dad, Ryan O'Connor?" I looked at her young face and saw my ex-wife's eyes staring back at me. I remembered a little girl looking up at me with those same eyes, holding her little arms up to me to be picked up. I looked at her and said, "I missed you, Mia." The next thing I knew, my daughter, Miael, was sitting on my lap, trying to hug the life out of me. We were both crying our eyes out with joy. This was the little girl I never thought I'd see again. She had grown into a beautiful young woman. For the next hour, we just sat and talked. We discussed all our feelings. Eventually, the conversation got around to my son. She said not to say anything to him until she had a chance to talk to him first. She promised to talk to him in their cabin after dinner. For the rest of the day, I wasn't worth a damn. I walked around the ranch with my head in a cloud and a silly grin on my face. My hands couldn't figure out what was going on with me. They knew that I hadn't been to town lately and wouldn't go near a guest. After dinner, I was in my office trying to do some paperwork when the door burst open, and a 16-year-old whirlwind ran in shouting, "You're my dad." The next thing I knew, we were standing in the middle of my office, trying to hug each other to death. Alex had grown into someone I would be proud of. The next morning, I grabbed this special cell phone, saddled a horse, and started to ride out into the hills to have a private conversation with my uncle, Frank. Frank's son answered the phone. I said, "Hi, cuz." He hesitated a minute and replied, "Hi, cubby," with a smile in his voice. The next thing you knew, we were both talking at the same time, like a couple of excited kids. When we finally calmed down enough to talk, I told him about my kids and asked why we were put in danger by them being sent out to see me. My cousin explained it was his father's idea, and he would put my Uncle Frank on the phone. My uncle came on. He sounded old and tired, but there was genuine happiness in his voice as he talked to me. It seemed that Don Victor had died. He had left no one to run his empire, so the council had divided it up, the largest portion going to my uncle. My uncle had lifted the bounty on my head, and it was safe to return home now. I told him that I was established out here and couldn't leave everything. I promised to come home for Christmas and stay through the new year. I thanked my uncle for the gift of my children and explained that they would be staying with me until they needed to return for school if they wanted. On my way back to the main house, the cell phone rang again. It was my cousin. He explained that my uncle was failing, and these were probably the last holidays he would be with us. He said my uncle had cancer, and it was terminal. I promised I would be there for the holidays. That night, I had my housekeeper open up 2 of the extra bedrooms in the main house. I only used the master suite and had closed up the other 6 bedrooms. The next day, while my kids were out playing rancher, I had all their things moved into their new rooms. They came running into my office, yelling that someone had stolen their stuff. Later that day, I just smiled and pointed upstairs to the 2nd floor. You guys moved, I told them. They disappeared upstairs to inspect their new digs. After a lot of noise from the 2nd floor, they returned. They wanted to know why I had taken all the trouble to move their stuff when they were scheduled to go back east next weekend. That's what you think, I said. I explained my phone call with Uncle Frank and that if they wanted, they could stay until school started. There were 2 very happy teenagers in that room. They said the rooms were beautiful, but they wanted a few things from town to personalize their rooms. I tried to protest, but it was 2 against 1. So I said they could take one of the pickup trucks into town tomorrow. As I watched them head to town, I started having second thoughts about letting them take a truck to town. I could just see the back of that pickup piled full when they returned. The truck wasn't exactly full, but it's not as if they didn't give it the old Scouts try. I was told to keep out of their rooms until they had a chance to fix them up. That was the last I saw of them for the next couple of days. They stayed busy in their rooms. When the great unveiling finally arrived, I was marched upstairs after promising not to peek and made to close my eyes. When I was allowed to open my eyes in each room, I saw typical teenager stuff. My son's room had all the wall posters of his favorite sports figures and a couple of car posters. Somehow, he even managed to sneak a swimsuit poster into the mix. His sister gave the poster a disapproving look and muttered something that sounded like 304 under her breath. I kept my mouth shut. I really couldn't understand what she had to complain about. I kind of liked the poster. When we reached her room, I could see the female touches. There was no doubt that this was a young woman's room. As I looked around, I couldn't help but notice the large framed photo of me on her nightstand, just like the one on her brother's night table. My daughter's desk was also decorated with a framed picture of me. As I looked at the photos, I realized they had all been taken of me here on the ranch. I was told that my son and daughter both wanted my face to be the first thing they saw in the morning and the last thing at night. I got one of those big lumps in my throat. I had missed so many years with my children. Over the next couple of months, we discussed everything that had happened during the 13 years I was gone from their lives. One night, we ran out of things to talk about, so I was asked about their mother and why I left. I had dreaded this moment from the first time we were reunited, but I had to tell them the truth. I talked about leaving work early that day because of the fire, finding their mother and her lover in bed, going into a fit of rage, recovering, and finding that I had beaten their mother's boyfriend to death with a baseball bat and injured her too. I told them that I had regretted that moment of violence since. I explained calling my cousin and him taking over. I told them about being given the briefcase with my new identity and being told I could never return. My son looked at me and said, "I'm glad she went nuts and is in a mental hospital. I never want to see her again after what she did." My daughter just sat there and looked sad. I made a mental note to ask my uncle about my ex when I visited and find out what was going on with her. I guess I needed closure because, deep down in my heart, I still missed her. I had to ask her why. Summer ended before any of us wanted it to. The kids and I knew it would be almost 3 months before we could see each other again. We promised to call and email each other, but it's not the same as seeing their faces across the table or the room every day. As much as I'd like to say it didn't, time just dragged. It felt like 2 or 3 years before those 3 months went by. My entire crew took me to the airport and started me on the trip home. They knew most of the story about my divorce and estrangement from my kids. What they didn't know was about the violence and my ties to organized crime. They just knew I wanted to get home and see my children again. I arrived back east before I was scheduled. I had told them I was due on Friday, the day before Christmas. I was a week early. My guys couldn't stand me moping around the ranch, so they moved everything up and just about carried me to the airport. So there I was, pushing the button on the intercom next to the gate where the cab had dropped me off. A very tough-sounding voice said, "Yeah?" I asked if my cousin was home and was told, "Maybe. Tell him Ryan's here," I said. Not 2 minutes later, my cousin was running out the front door yelling to open the gate and let me in. The guards must have thought we were nuts standing in the middle of the driveway, hugging and calling each other four-letter words. The next thing I knew, my kids were joining in on the hugging. My cousin and I had cleaned up our language by then. I looked up and saw my uncle in the doorway. He was in a wheelchair being pushed by a nurse. He appeared to be a shadow of his former self. I untangled myself from the mob of family members and went up to my uncle. I put my arms around him and said, "It's good to be home again. Thanks for making it all possible." I looked at his face and saw the tears forming in his eyes. I whispered in his ear, "Tough guys don't cry." So I was right. You always were a chicken. His smile lit up his face. "Don't let my secret out," he said. Later, when we were alone, my cousin exclaimed that it was the best his father had looked in months. He didn't want to know what I whispered in his dad's ear, but thanked me for making him a little happier. We celebrated Christmas with every relative and family member there. There must have been close to 400 people in that party house. My cousin thanked everybody for coming and talked about the upcoming year. My uncle was handed the microphone, and he said a few words about how important family was. All the men stood and toasted him while the rest of the people there applauded. I knew my uncle was touched, but as a hard guy, he couldn't show it. I got up and walked over to him. I took his hand to say something when he snatched it back and said into the mic, "I don't hold hands." That comment brought the house down. There was nothing left for me to do but follow tradition and kiss him on both cheeks. When I got done, I looked into his face, and he was smiling from ear to ear. I guess he had gotten the best of me. On Christmas, we only celebrated with immediate family. My uncle was too weak for anything fancy. We spent New Year's Day in the hospital, watching him slowly lose his battle with cancer. He died on February 8th in his sleep. He left us peacefully. I hoped he would meet up with his wife, who had died 7 years earlier. When we walked into the funeral home a few days later, I was impressed. The entire establishment was being used only for him. The floral arrangements filled the entire structure, and the people standing in line to pay their respects formed a line that stretched around the block. Since it was January and cold outside, the people standing in line were given hot drinks and small warm sandwiches. I don't know who planned that, but the mourners were thankful. On the day of his burial, his funeral service was held at the largest church in the area. The bishop himself conducted the funeral mass and the graveside service. The church overflowed with people, as did the graveside service. I got a big lump in my throat as I watched his casket being lowered into the ground next to his bride. They were together again. Both my children stood at my side through all of this. Their eyes were never dry. My uncle was their alternate father for most of their years growing up after their grandparents died. The children might have me back in their lives now, but they would miss their substitute father. After the funeral, my daughter was in a funk for a few days. When I asked her what was wrong, all she did was ask me a question, "Can we visit Mom?" I had hoped I would never need to see my ex again. The last time I saw her, she was with my enemy. Here it was, 12 years later, and the vision of that moment was still fresh in my head. I swallowed hard and told my daughter I would make arrangements for the visit. I asked my son if he wanted to go. "Hell no. I never want to see that 304 again," was the reply I got. I made a mental note to try and get him some help with these issues. A few weeks later, my daughter and I were pulling into a state institution. I found out from my cousin that my uncle refused to pay for her care. He blamed her for all my troubles and had her declared a ward of the state. She was warehoused in a state hospital with no effective care. We were directed to a doctor's office in the facility. He was listed as her care provider. After a very long wait, My daughter and I were escorted into his office. I found us face-to-face with an Asian doctor who spoke broken English. He had a patient folder in front of him that he explained was my wife's patient history. He had another pile of patient folders on his desk. It was about 18 inches high. I asked if they were all his patients, and he replied, "Yes, we are shorthanded." At that point, my daughter started asking questions about her mother. As I listened, I knew that he didn't have a clue as to who this patient was. I asked him a very direct question. "Does my wife still take her daily run?" He answered in his heavily accented English, of course. At that point, I grabbed my daughter's hand and squeezed hard so she wouldn't blow up. You see, her mother was paralyzed from the waist down and had been that way for 12 years. Running was not on her agenda. I asked if we could go on the ward and visit her. He called an orderly, and we were escorted to her ward. We identified ourselves to the head nurse and asked to see my ex. The nurse was very nice and knew all about my ex. She explained that she was completely withdrawn. She hadn't said a word in almost 12 years. She had paranoia and had closed off the world to protect herself. She then escorted us to the day room. My wife had once been beautiful. She weighed about 120 pounds and stood 5'7". When she walked into a room, every head turned to look at her, but that was at least 10 years ago. Today, she weighed around 300 pounds, had stringy unwashed hair, and was confined to a wheelchair. Her face had that blank, faraway look that only the mentally ill can have. My daughter walked up to her and started talking. I could tell nothing was getting through. My heart went out to my daughter. She was trying so hard she wanted her mother to recognize her. I was walking over to give her some support when my ex's eyes turned to me. There was a momentary glint of recognition before my ex started screaming at the top of her lungs and thrashing her arms around. Two of the orderlies grabbed her, and the duty nurse administered a needle to her. I don't know what was in that shot, but it knocked her right out. The duty nurse said that was the first time she had reacted in the 5 years she had been assigned to this ward. She took our information and promised to call me if there were any changes. We left that hellhole. In the car on the way back to my uncle's compound, my daughter broke down and cried her heart out. I promised her I would look into having her mother moved to a private care facility near the ranch. Yeah, I was a softie that way. My daughter could visit my ex and see that her mother received treatment. After returning to the ranch, I started my search. I found a facility about 120 miles away. It was well respected in the mental health community. I paid the place a visit. I liked the place. The doctors and staff seemed very professional and caring toward their charges. I sat with the head doctor, the doctor who had helped me limit my nightmares many years ago, and discussed my wife's condition, right down to her first outbreak in at least 5 years upon seeing me. While he didn't like her violent reaction to me, it did prove that she was partly aware of what was going on around her. He liked that. We made arrangements to have her transferred to his care, and I called my daughter with the good news. She cried. A couple of months went by when the doctor called me and asked if he could have a photograph of my face. When I asked why, he said, "He'll explain later." So I sent him an 8x10 I had made from one of the pictures my kids took. Between visiting colleges for my daughter to attend and moving both kids out to the ranch, I forgot all about my ex-wife and the picture. So I was surprised when my ex-wife's doctor called and asked if he could talk to me face-to-face at my ranch. I agreed, and we made an appointment for him to visit. It was a nice spring day when the doctor came out. Since he rode, we decided to visit one of my high meadows and just enjoy the view. On the way out there, we made small talk. Once there, we dismounted and sat in the grass. He told me that they were making progress with my wife. Her weight was down about 90 pounds and falling off her like crazy. She was starting to take notice of her appearance and was asking the nurses to brush her hair. Of course, she still doesn't speak, but she will point to a brush if she wants her hair done. He then dropped a bomb on me. If my ex was shown a picture of me, she started yelling, "He's going to kill me too," and would go wild. She usually had to be sedated to get her to stop screaming. He wanted to know if her fear of me was founded. He then just sat there and looked at me, waiting for me to speak. I thought about what to say and made my decision. I told him everything. I asked if what I told him was covered by doctor-patient privilege. He told me to give him $1, and then I would be his patient. The money changed hands. I began by telling him that I was raised in an organized crime family. The Don was my uncle, and I was his trusted bookkeeper. I knew everything about his business. I knew where the money came from and where it went. I had lists of every cop, politician, judge, and the general individuals taking bribes. My wife knew all about my job. I told him about arriving home earlier than expected one day and finding her in bed with her lover. I wasn't really too upset with her. I could just divorce her, but her lover was a different matter. He was my enemy, and he looked at me and smiled as if to laugh at me. His expression told me that my wife meant nothing to him. She was just a way to mock me with his power. I told the doctor that at that point, I lost it. I started beating him on the face with a baseball bat that I suddenly found in my hand. When I came out of the rage and could think clearly again, I found my ex's lover dead in the bed. His head was destroyed. My wife was lying on the bedroom floor unconscious but breathing. She showed marks on her body of having been hit with a bat. I did not remember hitting her. I then explained that my cousin arranged for the cleanup. I was put in a car and driven away. Eventually, I ended up here. I told him that they made my wife's lover's body disappear and tossed her down a flight of stairs to make it seem as if she had fallen. They then set the bedroom on fire to hide any signs of the incident. The house was almost completely destroyed by the fire. He then sat there a long time, thinking before he started talking again. He said the blind rage was understandable. The loss of any memory of my beating the man to death was probably a defense mechanism used by my brain to protect me from the horror of what I'd done. He then asked me if that was the only time I used violence on another human being and if I had nightmares or blackouts since. I explained that my uncle had made me their bookkeeper because I wasn't wired for the violent side of the business. My uncle always called me the gentleman man. I never hurt another human being, and I did not have nightmares about hurting other people that I remembered. But every once in a while, I woke up screaming. He explained that I had probably buried the whole thing deep enough in my subconscious that it wasn't affecting me normally. He would attempt to bring up the hidden action so I could learn to deal with it, but in my case, it would best be left alone. He did outline a list of symptoms and made me promise to call him if any of them occurred. I then discussed with him my son's damnation of his mother and asked what to do. He asked me to bring my son in to see him sometime so they could talk. Head handle my son's anger. We left the upper meadow, both lost in our own thoughts. When we got back to the main house, he asked me to stay away from my ex-wife until he told me otherwise. He wanted my daughter to visit her mother as often as possible. He said it would be good for both of them. We parted in silence, both of us in deep thought. My daughter was in her junior year, and my son was a freshman. He was studying agriculture with his eye on going in with me on the ranch. My daughter was a pre-med student. She said that she had plans to be a shrink eventually, but it took many years of study to become one. She said that seeing the way a good doctor had helped her mother is what made up her mind. I started to notice that every time I talked to my daughter, I heard all about what she and Bill had done. Pretty soon, that's all I was hearing was Bill this and Bill that. I wasn't the dumbest father in the world, so I suggested that she invite him to have Christmas dinner with us and meet the family. I wanted to check him out and make sure he was good enough for my baby. About an hour later, I got the call to set an extra place for Christmas dinner, and could he stay in one of the spare rooms for the week, as his parents were going to Europe for the holidays. I was no fool. I agreed. When Bill and my daughter showed up, I was pleasantly surprised. Bill was a very pleasant and polite young man. He was about 62 and 190 pounds. He had sandy hair and brown eyes. He was also a pre-med major, but he wanted to be a surgeon. My daughter said he was cute, but I, for one, never looked at another guy and thought, he's cute. I'm just not wired that way. Anyway, I liked him and thought that he was a good catch for my daughter. I also noticed that their eyes never left each other. For the next 2 weeks, they had it bad. They followed each other around the ranch, much to the enjoyment of my hired hands. I kept getting called Gramps and asked if I needed to borrow a couple of dollars for a reception. You get the idea. On Valentine's Day, they got engaged. A date was set for an August wedding. Soon, I found myself standing in the foyer of a local church, waiting for the bride to show up. As I got more and more nervous, the priest leaned over and whispered, "They're always late. Don't worry, she'll show up." And she did. As we were walking down the aisle, I noticed a wheelchair at the outside of the first row of pews on the bride's side. I also spotted my friend, the shrink, sitting with a woman in the front row. I was so engaged with walking the bride-to-be down the aisle that I gave them both a pass. When I did the handoff of my daughter at the altar, I turned to take my seat. Imagine my surprise when I found myself looking into my ex's eyes. I felt my daughter's hand on my arm, and she whispered, "It's okay, Daddy." I invited her. I took my seat next to her, expecting her to start screaming at any minute. My friend, the shrink, just gave me a knowing smile that said, "It's okay. She'll be good. Just don't get too close." When the priest finally pronounced them husband and wife, my eyes were wet. I happened to glance at my ex, and the tears were just running down her cheeks. When the newlyweds turned to walk down the aisle, I started to move across my ex so that I wouldn't block her view. Her doctor grabbed my arm and shook his head no. He then whispered in my ear, "Don't touch her. She's not that strong yet." The moment passed, and I joined the procession out of the church. I didn't see my ex again that day. At the reception, as I was dancing with my daughter, she commented to me that her mom had come a long way. I thought about my feelings toward my ex, and I guess I had come a long way also. I too was proud of her for all the ground she had gained. I guess some of the hate I had felt mellowed over the years. I made a note to call her doctor next week and make a golf date we needed to talk. The following week, while playing golf, we talked about my wife's progress. I complimented him on the progress he had made with her. He said she was still very fragile, and I could set her back years by just touching her, but her being at the wedding and sitting next to me was a great advance. I asked how he had gotten her to accept me. He explained that it all started with the 8x10 picture of me that he had requested years ago. He said he started by having the picture framed and put into his office where he met with her every day. At first, he put it on a shelf almost out of her sight. When she stopped her violent reactions to it, he moved it a little closer. After almost a year, he was able to put it on his desk and not freak her out. He then started discussing her feelings toward me and how my picture couldn't hurt her. One day at their meeting, she had a breakthrough and started talking about that day so many years ago. She remembered being with Frank, feeling Frank pull her over his head as if he was trying to use her to protect his head. She then felt this terrible pain in her back and knew something had hit her very hard. Frank then pushed her off to the floor. The pain in her back was so great she must have blacked out. The next thing she remembered was her husband checking to see if she was still alive. He left her lying on the floor in terrible pain. She remembered being thrown down the stairs. Her pain became so bad she blacked out again. The next thing she knew, a fireman was carting her outside, and she was coughing from the thick smoke. She noticed the terrible pain in her back had stopped, but she couldn't feel her legs anymore. The doctor explained that it was probably at this point her spinal cord was damaged, resulting in her paralysis. He told her my side of the story. When he finished, he took her back to her room. She had a lot of information to digest. The next time I heard about my wife was from my daughter. She asked if her mom could have Christmas dinner with all of us. I agreed, provided that it was okay with her doctor. I called the doctor the next day. Her doctor was a bit hesitant about attending this visit. Since the doctor and I were friends, I asked if he and his wife could attend and bring my ex with them. He felt this was better and agreed to the whole thing. On Christmas Day, the three of them arrived about an hour before dinner was scheduled to be served. My ex was wheeled into the living room where everybody was. At first, she seemed overwhelmed by all the people, but eventually, she settled down and actually tried to join in a few of the conversations. Me, I just kept out of her sight and out of any conversation she was in. I did not want to add to her stress level. At the dinner table, I was asked to give the blessing. I started by basically asking God to bless everyone there and help them to have a good year. I especially asked him to watch over the two newlyweds and to help my ex with her problems. I glanced over at her while I was saying this little prayer and found her shyly smiling at me. Her doctor gave me a very approving look. My daughter started crying, and my son just sat there in shock. No one else at the table knew the significance of my little prayer. For the next couple of hours, we had a typical Christmas dinner combined with an Italian feast. I swear there was enough food served to feed a third-world nation. When we finally crawled away from the table, there was not an empty space in my body. We all assembled in the living room for coffee and after-dinner drinks. I was sprawled in my lounge chair, resting my eyes when I sensed someone by my side. I peeked under my eyelids and saw my ex sitting there, just looking at my outstretched hand as if she wanted to touch it. I stayed completely still and suddenly felt a very soft touch on my hand. The touch was quickly withdrawn. I stayed still, pretending nothing happened. A few moments passed when I felt the touch again, this time firmer and longer lasting before I heard the wheelchair move away. When I opened my eyes, I saw her doctor holding both her hands and talking to her. Later, I found out that he was telling her that now she knew I wouldn't bite, exactly like he told her. He also told her that he felt there was a place for her in my heart. I guess I agreed. Later, when they were leaving, she glanced over at me and mouthed, "Thank you." Later in the week, I had a conference call with her doctor and my daughter. We all felt she was strong enough to spend Christmas Eve and Christmas Day at my house. Doc couldn't make it as he and his wife had a cruise booked, but he put my daughter in charge of her mother. I was told to be as low-key as possible and basically stay away from my ex and let her initiate any contact between us. When Christmas Eve finally rolled around, I was on pins and needles. I assumed that I would do something wrong and upset my ex and ruin Christmas for everyone. I decided to spend as much time as possible in one of the barns or out inspecting my holdings. I was walking between two of my buildings when I heard my ex call my name, and she was beckoning me over to her. I walked over to her and sat on one of the porch chairs, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. She wheeled her chair over to me and softly said, "Please don't be afraid of me. I know now that you never meant to hurt me all those years ago, and I would like to see if maybe we could be friends." Doc Hoy and I spent a lot of time talking about just this. I started to stand up when a scared look appeared in her eyes. I quickly sat back down, but my emotions took over and the tears started running down my cheeks. From somewhere only women know, a piece of tissue appeared, and she reached over and started to dry my eyes. She whispered that it was okay and asked if we could be friends again. I nodded my head yes. I also noticed my daughter and my son watching the whole exchange. They both looked very pleased. Later that night, I was somehow left alone with my wife. She needed to be carried upstairs and put on her bed. I told her that I'd find a couple of the women to help her. She shook her head no and asked if I'd do it instead because there was no reason to disturb everyone just for her. I walked over to her and bent over to pick her up when I felt her arms wrap around my neck, more like a hug than another person holding on for their safety. I slid my arms under her legs and slowly lifted her to my chest. As we were climbing the stairs, I realized that she wasn't holding her head up to watch where we were going, but had it buried in my chest as if she was trying to trace my scent. When I sat her down on the bed in one of my guest rooms, I had the distinct feeling that she did not want to let go. So I just stood there until she was ready. When she finally removed her arms from around my neck, I went downstairs and got her wheelchair. When I returned with her chair, she asked me to put her back in it and wait in her room while she prepared herself for bed. About 10 minutes passed before she was back. Her hair was up, her face was washed, and she was dressed in a simple cotton nightgown that covered her completely. I had turned down her bed while she was in the bathroom, so I put her in it and tucked her in. I leaned over to kiss her goodnight when she suddenly turned her head, so I only got her cheek. Whoops, I thought I had pushed her too hard and backed away. Little did I know the real reason for her turning her head. When I woke up the next morning, I had the distinct feeling that at some point during the night, she had wheeled herself into my room and sat looking at me. But then I figured it must have been a dream brought on by all I had eaten. I got dressed and walked into the hallway. She was sitting at the top of the stairs, waiting for someone to help her downstairs. When I came into sight, she held her arms up to me and said, "Please." I carried her to the kitchen where everyone was gathering. It got very quiet in there when I was setting her down. I went back upstairs, got her wheelchair, and arranged her in it. Later that day, we all gathered around the tree and exchanged presents. It was a typical family Christmas, our first in almost 15 years. At one point, I looked up and saw my ex just sitting there, surrounded by piles of gifts for her. Then I noticed she was just softly crying. I started to stand up when my daughter walked over to her and said, "Mom, we've got 15 years of gifts to give you, so buck up and start opening them." My ex started smiling from ear to ear and returned to opening her gifts. At dinner that night, we were talking about our plans for New Year's Eve when my ex interrupted and asked no one in particular if she could spend that holiday here with us too. I opened my big mouth and told her that we had included her in our plans. I then added that she could spend the entire week with us unless she wanted to go back to the hospital and return here later in the week. She wheeled herself over to where I was sitting and gave me a great big hug. She also pulled me to her and whispered, "Thank you," in my ear. We had a great week and a super New Year's. She stayed with me until everyone returned to their other lives, and just the two of us remained in my ranch house. We decided that she was to return to the hospital after spending just one more night. Late that night, I awoke in my room and found her sitting in her wheelchair. A storm was raging outside, and the electric was off. She told me it was very cold in her room and asked if she could sleep with me. I really don't remember giving her my permission, but all of a sudden, she was in my bed next to me. I started to put my arms around her when she said there were rules if she stayed in my bed. Rule 1, no sex. She couldn't feel anything anyway. Rule 2, no kissing or any other show of affection. Rule 3, holding her in my arms was allowed as well as cuddling, and greatly wanted. So I wrapped my arms around her and pulled her to me. She placed her head on my chest and softly sighed. In a very soft voice, she said, "I love your smell. It's the smell of a real man. I've missed it all these years." We cuddled and talked late into the night. The next morning, it was still snowing too heavily to leave. I suddenly realized that her helpless routine was just that, a routine. She hopped around between her wheelchair and various pieces of furniture as if she was never handicapped. When I challenged her about it, she admitted that all she really wanted to do was feel my arms around her. Later that afternoon, her doctor called. They talked for about 2 hours. She told him everything she did for the last week. I heard parts of the call. In all the years we were married, I never heard her talk as openly as she did with him. She never shared like that with me. After a while, she called me to the phone. The doctor praised her and told me it was the very best he had seen her in all those years she had been his patient. But he also said she needed to return to the hospital. She still wasn't ready to return to normal yet. She had one more issue to face. When I later called the doctor and asked about the issue, he just said she would tell me all about it when she's ready. Damn doctors. It was about 2 weeks before Easter when my caller ID indicated the hospital was calling. I answered, expecting her doctor to be on the other end. "Well, you could have knocked me over with a feather," when I heard my ex's voice on the other end. She asked if the family was going to celebrate Easter at my ranch and if she could attend. There was something she wanted to share with all of us. I agreed to pick her up at the hospital a few days before everyone was scheduled to arrive. She wanted to share her announcement with me first. I assumed that she had come to grips with whatever her issue was and had beaten it. She now had to share it with her family. Her voice sounded very weak and a little shaky, but I assumed it was from talking with me. Later, her doctor called me, and we spoke privately. He said the last 4 months had been hell for her, and I would be shocked by her appearance, but what she went through just had to be done. I picked her up 3 days before the kids were scheduled to arrive. Her face was tired and drawn. She looked as if she had the weight of the world on her shoulders. It was spring, and all the wildflowers in the pastures were in bloom, and the trees were opening their leaves again. I loved this time of the year. It was a season of rebirth. I wheeled my ex's chair around the area, pointing out all the beauty. We had a great afternoon. It was as if we'd never been apart all those years. That night, as I was carrying her up to bed, she asked if she could sleep with me because she really missed being held by me. Sometime in the night, I was awakened by her. When I tried to stop her, she just said, "Please, I must do this for you." I noticed she was putting protection on me she had never used on me before, but I was too far gone to care why. By then, she was crying. When I tried to pull her up, she resisted my effort, telling me to remember Rule 2, no kissing. She then began to tell me her story. She told me how Frank first seduced her using drugs, and that after the first couple of times, he had completely controlled her. The doctors explained to her that she had mental problems all her life, and Frank just happened to use them to control her. She was as addicted to him as a heroin addict was to heroin. She then talked about the night I found her in bed with him. She said she never knew I was there until Frank used her as a shield to block my blows with the baseball bat. She talked about the terrible pain suddenly appearing in her back and Frank pushing her to the floor. She knew I was hitting him, but she was in too much pain to move. She passed out only to awaken being carried out of the burning house by a fireman. She thought I had tried to kill her. When she came to in the hospital a few days later, She was informed that her back had been broken and her spinal cord damaged. She'd never have the use of her legs again. It was shortly thereafter she began her descent into the madness that held her captive for the next 12 years. She said her doctor explained that my daughter and I had rescued her from the care she was receiving at that state institution and put her in his care. He managed to make her see that I was not trying to take her life and still loved her after all she had done. She then dropped the bad news on me. It seemed that Frank or one of his friends had left her with a gift HIV. Because of her poor care and long period of madness, her HIV had progressed into full-blown AIDS before being diagnosed. There was nothing the doctors could do for her but make her comfortable. She wouldn't be here next Christmas. Now it was my turn to cry, and cry I did. All night long, the whole time holding her as tightly as I could. We told the rest of the family after dinner on the Saturday before Easter. That Sunday morning, all the family attended Mass. We needed God's help that day. She left us in October. She wanted to be cremated, and her ashes spread under a huge old oak tree at the hospital. She explained that under that tree, she and her doctor held the talks that brought her back out of the darkness. It was a special place for her. The next spring, I had a marble bench installed with a plaque that had her name and dates on it, along with the words, "The world was a little better place while she was here." I came to the hospital about every month or so to play golf with her doctor. It seemed that David and I had gotten to be pretty good friends over the years, and sometimes it just felt good to talk with him. We spent quite a few hours at the 19th hole after our golf games. David's wife always scolded us and made me sleep over instead of trying to drive home. Before leaving, on my way back home, I'd stop at the hospital, sit on the bench, and bring my wife up to speed on everything the family was doing. I guess I missed her a lot. I had an empty spot in my heart for her. I found that I had always loved her. The bench became a popular spot for other families to sit when they were visiting their loved ones who were guests at the hospital. One day, a landscaper showed up and made the area into a small stone patio with a walkway so wheelchairs could navigate the area. Soon, there were a couple of flower beds, and later, a small pond was put in. It even had goldfish. I knew my ex would have just loved it. When everyone visited her spot, while we were sitting there one day, my daughter and son-in-law told us my ex and we were going to be grandparents next spring. I don't know about my ex, but I know I was smiling from ear to ear. Ethan, a few years later, I got a call from my son, who was in his senior year at college. He asked if he could bring a friend home to the ranch for Christmas. He said his buddy was studying to be a vet and would love to see our operation. This was the first time since he went away that he had ever made this kind of request, so I agreed. The week before Christmas, I saw my black SUV pull up the driveway. That SUV was my pride and joy. Let me tell you that story. 3 months ago, I opened the side of the garage where I kept the monster and found my son's subcompact there and my truck gone. In the subcompact was a note: needed extra cargo space. Took your truck. Love, Ethan. After walking around the ranch all day, making everybody's life miserable, I finally calmed down. I remembered what poor gas mileage the SUV got and thought my son outsmarted himself. Then I remembered I kept a gas credit card in the glove compartment. Oh well, he was my only son. My SUV pulled up near where I was standing, and my son hopped out. The passenger side door opened, and his friend hopped out. I was stunned. There stood one of the most beautiful redheads I had ever had the pleasure to see. She stood about 58. She took my son's hand, and they walked over to me. I found myself looking into Ellis' green eyes as my son introduced us. I thought to myself, why doesn't the vet I use look this good? Over the next few days, I learned her history. She was an only child who lived with her divorced mother one state east of us. Her father had left her mother for a 22-year-old dancer he met. They took every dime he and her mother had and left for a small island in the South Pacific. Her father left her and her mother with nothing but debt. Her mother was forced to file bankruptcy and moved the two of them into a small apartment in a so-so neighborhood. Her mother was able to find a job as a receptionist or billing clerk for a doctor. The job paid their expenses, but there wasn't much left over for other things. Her mother got a job as a waitress at night in a nice restaurant to help make ends meet so Ella could attend college. She was a straight-A student and received a scholarship to my son's college, but had to work as a waitress in a local diner for spending money. She still managed to carry a 3.8 GPA. She was a sharp, hard-working young woman. I was proud that she let my son into her life. I did notice that there was never very much space between the two of them. I figured someone had sewn Velcro onto their clothes. The two of them spent their Christmas recess checking out all the livestock on my ranch. Since they were usually gone from sunrise to sunset, I figured that they were using the time to do what young people do when mom or dad isn't around. Imagine my surprise when they started telling me which animals and which pastures needed a little TLC. By the time they left, Ella had an invitation to spend Christmas recess with us. I felt she could visit any time she wanted. I was saving money. Actually, I figured out what my regular vet would have charged for his services and sent her that amount in cash. Cash, you ask? I figured she might tear up a check, but it's hard to destroy real money. A couple of days after Ella and my son left, I got a phone call from him. It seemed that Ella wanted to spend the holidays with us, but that would mean her mother would have to spend the holidays alone. It would be the first time since Ella was born that she couldn't spend Christmas with her mother. She didn't know what to do. For me, it was a no-brainer. Her mom could spend the holidays out here too. It wasn't as if we didn't have the room, and if she didn't want to stay in the main house, there were all the guest houses for the Dude Ranch part of our operation. A week later, I got the okay from my son. After a few more phone calls, we got the date set in stone. I arranged for her mom to have a first-class round trip to get to an airport near the college at my expense. That way, she could ride to the ranch with her daughter and my son, and I would avoid being required to entertain her until the kids arrived. I thought it was a win-win. When the time for them to arrive came, I found myself standing around the front of the main house, watching down the driveway. All right, I wanted to see the kids again, I'll admit it. Besides my son and Ella, his sister and family were scheduled to arrive around the same time also. My daughter actually arrived first, about 5 minutes before my son. My daughter, her husband Bill, and their baby Amanda and I were still standing in the driveway when the SUV zipped in. My daughter and her husband walked over to greet my son and meet his new love. I walked over a little slower because I was carrying my granddaughter. Ella and my son hopped out of the front seat. The back door opened, and I couldn't believe what walked out. Ella's mom was an older version of Ella, but a woman with the kind of beauty only maturity can bring. I admitted I just stood there and stared. My daughter walked over to me to get her baby and whispered, "Dad, shut your mouth. It's hanging open, and you're embarrassing us." I regained control of my body and walked over to welcome Ella's mom. I was introduced to Olivia. She had the most beautiful red hair, green eyes, and a woman's body. I was so gobsmacked by her presence that I couldn't put 2 words together, let alone a whole sentence. She looked at me and said hello, and gave me a 1,000,000-kilowatt smile. My daughter gave Olivia the baby to hold. I think I wasn't trusted not to drop my granddaughter. The 2 weeks they spent with us went by too fast. I took Olivia for tours of the ranch. She had owned a horse until her divorce and was a good rider. I fixed her up with a gentle mare, and we toured my spread. She loved the views and all the different animals we raised. We discussed our lives and our families as we rode. By the time it was for her to go home, I felt I knew more about her than most husbands and wives do after 20 or more years of marriage. We chatted like lifelong friends. After everybody left, I got lonely, even though I had 15 people working for me at the ranch. I couldn't wait for spring break when the kids said they would be back. Olivia didn't think she could get any time off to come out when the kids were here. Without her knowing, I called the doctor she worked for. He and I agreed that I would send him enough money to pay her salary for 2 weeks and pay a temp to replace her. I also called my cousin to see if I could borrow his plane. And who was it that said crime doesn't pay? When it was time for her to fly out, I called her and explained that the travel times had changed. She would need to bring her luggage to work, and a car would pick her up and get her to the airport. A livery chauffeur walked into her office, asked for her luggage, and then escorted her out to a stretch limo. When they drove away, all her co-workers were standing in the doorway, mouths open. She was on her cell phone thanking me when the limo pulled up next to my cousin's Gulfstream. The chauffeur introduced her to the pilot and escorted her into the plane. Her cell phone was still connected to me, but she had stopped talking. All I could hear was a soft sobbing, so I waited until the plane blocked the cell signal before I hung up. I think she was impressed. I had an airstrip on my property. One year, My cousin was complaining about the 3 to 4 hour trip from an airport that would handle his jet to my ranch. We selected a site on my property that would work for a runway. About a month later, construction vehicles arrived, and the work began. A few months after that, I had a 10,000-foot runway with all the trimmings and a big hangar to store the plane. When I called him to ask about me sharing the costs, I got, "Don't worry about it." Anyway, that's where I was sitting in my pickup when the plane landed. Olivia deplaned and attacked me with a million questions. I promised to tell her everything after dinner. After dinner that night, there were just the two of us sitting in my study. I had a small fire going, and we were sipping brandy. I told her about being raised by one of the largest crime families on the West Coast. While I was not involved in the family business, I enjoyed a lot of the benefits. She asked me a few questions more to establish my moral values than about the family business. I must have answered them correctly because she walked over and sat down on the couch next to me. She put her head on my shoulder. We sat that way until we couldn't stay awake any longer and went to our separate rooms to sleep. The next morning, she was back to being her old self. At Easter dinner, I put my foot in my mouth again. I asked my son if he had taken Ella to meet his mother at the hospital. I heard Olivia drop her fork. I looked at her and gave her the well-talk later. "Look." My son explained that he thought it was more important to bring Ella home to meet me and Olivia before bringing her to his mother. I guess I passed the mom-in-law test because I could see she agreed with his decision. After dinner, I explained to Olivia the entire story about my ex-wife and why she was in the hospital. She listened, never interrupting, and when I finished, she softly asked if she could meet her sometime. I promised to set it up for her if she really wanted to meet my ex. The next few days were like we were on vacation, but this time we were taking a family vacation instead of one with friends. My daughter stayed in the main house because of the baby. Ella, my son, and Olivia stayed in the guest cottages. My daughter and I made sure the kids never got to spend any time alone in the main house. I didn't want to have to explain a lot of things to my granddaughter when she started to talk. The week just seemed to disappear. One day they all showed up, and the next, they were gone. Olivia flew back to her job, and I didn't know when I'd see her again. She said something about taking time off around the 4th of July, so maybe she could visit then. I thought that if it didn't kill me, the anticipation might cause me to lose my mind. I was almost as excited as a teenage boy going on his first date. What was it about this woman that turned me into a schoolboy? I hadn't felt this way in many years. When she first left, I called her at her office twice a week. It got to be so bad that I had to limit myself to once a week just so I could get some work done. I swear, if my hired hands didn't know how to run the place, I'd have been out of business. When the 4th finally rolled around, we had a great time. I even dragged her to the local fireworks display, where she told me about the last time she had seen fireworks. We made plans to visit her old stomping grounds and see her mother, who was still alive. Ella and my son were attending the festivities with us. I was having a great time. One night, I was sitting in the living room with Olivia, just talking about nothing when she suddenly blurted out that she was falling for me and was scared. I sat there with a stupid grin on my face, knowing I should do something but not knowing what. I asked if she wanted to talk about it. That just made her mad. I tried a different approach, explaining how much I was looking forward to her visit and how much I loved seeing her in my kitchen in the mornings, seeing her at the dinner table, and just being with her. I guess I'm a romantic old fool, but that's how I felt about her. When the weekend was over, Olivia flew back home, and I felt empty again. She didn't call for a couple of weeks. She said she needed time to think about us. I felt like a 16-year-old waiting for his prom date to say yes. It wasn't a good feeling. Finally, she called and apologized for the long delay. I told her I understood and then asked what she decided. I was scared to hear her answer. I would miss her more than I thought possible. She replied that she wanted to continue the relationship and see where it would lead. She wanted to take things slow, as her divorce had been very messy. When I told her I had no problem with that, she said she wanted to come out and visit over the Labor Day weekend. We started seeing each other again, taking things very slowly. Labor Day finally arrived, and she showed up with Ella. That was when I found out the two of them had been talking. My son kept looking at me and muttering, "Sucker." I figured they must have been plotting something. That night, we were sitting on the porch, looking at the stars and sipping brandy when she said, "I think it's time we made our relationship more formal." That's how it started. At Christmas, I got down on one knee and proposed. I was accepted. We planned on being married the following August. I'd have to start making the preparations because my ranch was going to host a wedding again. Thanks for watching. What did you think of the unexpected twists and emotional moments in this story? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more captivating tales. Stay tuned for the next one.